Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Cristina Talens, and I'm the Director of Modern Slavery Risk Assessments at the Wilberforce Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our second webinar at the Wilberforce Business Academy. So in today's presentation, we're going to be looking at upcoming EU due diligence law on labour and human rights and the potential implications for companies that are trading within the EU. So although the UK is no longer part of the EU, the standards and the regulations that companies have to meet are the same if you want to access that market. So with that in mind, over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be covering off some of the key provisions of the new EU directive and looking at what is already in place in terms of legislation in the UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. So I would like to point out that this presentation is being recorded, but we will stop the recording when we come to your questions at the end. During my presentation, you're all very welcome to send in your questions by using the chat box at the bottom of your screens. And again, I think there should be about 15 minutes for us to go through any of your questions and have a group discussion. Given that we've got a few people here today, we may not be able to go through all of your questions, but if we need to, I can come back to you privately or via email. Okay, so let me just share my presentation. Okay, so the upcoming EU due diligence law on labour and human rights. First of all, I'd like to give you a little bit of background into who we are as an institute. So we are part of the University of Hull. We were founded in 2006, and the institute has an interdisciplinary focus with staff from the social sciences, from history, from law and education. I'm not actually an academic, I'm a practitioner, and I bring a lot of the learning that I have on the field back into the institute so that we can develop new ways of working going forward with businesses. Our team have direct experience of dealing with forced labor, debt bondage, trafficking and smuggling in supply chains. I am a trained social auditor, which means that I go into a lot of companies to look at labor and human rights conditions. Our risk assessment services were set up just ahead of the Modern Slavery Act in 2014 to help businesses address some of the modern slavery risks within their own operations and within their supply chains. My background, as I said earlier, I'm Director of Risk Assessments here at the Wilberforce Institute. I originally studied international business, but I went into work at Anti-Slavery International and also worked at the Anti-Slavery International offices in France, Spain, and Italy. I have been doing a lot of social audits over the last 20 years, mainly in agriculture, but also in manufacturing and logistics and supply chains internationally. I did work at the UN Global Programme against trafficking and smuggling of human beings. So I've worked on projects with origin and destination countries for people that have been trafficked. I've also worked with commodity companies. So I've sat in buying teams, and that means that I've had a lot of dealing with the Ethical Trading Initiative in London with retailers and international brands. For those of you that don't know what the Ethical Trading Initiative is, it's a tripartite organization which represents companies with over a collective turnover of 107 billion pounds. And they sit alongside NGOs and trade unions to monitor labor and human rights conditions in supply chains, and they make a commitment to improve those conditions. So why should we focus on EU due diligence laws? Why is it important if you're a UK-based company and we've come out of the EU? Well, the first thing is that if you are selling to EU clients, or you have whether you're offering services or products, it will be potentially a standard requirement for you to meet the same legislation if you want to access those markets to sell your products and services. Secondly, it's going to avoid the duplication of efforts on labor and human rights. And same sectors, same supply chains, but coming from different national borders, it's better to have one clear-cut approach to dealing with the issues. And this means that it will create a level playing field. So we have competitive businesses that some of whom have been adopting and applying UNGP principles for a long time, or monitoring labor and human rights in their supply chain for over 15 years. But other companies in the same sector haven't been doing that, and have, they've been a lot more lax in the way that they address labor and human rights risks. And then fourthly, it's it's about actively managing the risks in supply chains. So again, for those companies that are applying already the United Nations global principles for business and human rights, guidance principles on business and human rights, they will already be meeting perhaps some of the provisions around the EU due diligence laws. The objectives for today are, firstly, to help you understand the background to EU due diligence on labor and human rights, where it's come from. Secondly, to look at the provisions that the new EU directive makes and what it expects from businesses in the way that they deal with their own operations and their supply chains. Thirdly, we'll be looking at what legislation is already in place across different EU countries, and I'm going to include the UK Europe as a European country in that, because we have the Modern Slavery Act. And then at the end, we'll just cover off any questions that you might have and look at best practice. The background to the EU directive, as I've said earlier, for those of you that are already working on labor and human rights, you will know that embedding these standards is a very difficult process within a company. There are various issues beyond labor and human rights around climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, the damage that's being caused to biodiversity, waste and the way that we deal with waste, which is probably just as important as climate change, how we ensure transparency in supply chains. Some companies go further than others. There is also, since 2011 and even before then, really, this whole imbalance between the voluntary standards that are being applied versus regulations. So for a long time, many companies have been adopting voluntary standards and voluntary codes of practice, but it hasn't been a regulated level playing field for all the companies in those sectors. So it can put some companies at a competitive disadvantage. So really, the background to this EU directive is making sure that companies in different countries across the EU are all applying the same rules and are being held to account. I won't read the whole definition here, but the UNGP definition of due diligence is a process to identify, assess, prevent, mitigate, seize, monitor, communicate, account for, address, and remedy the potential or adverse impacts on human rights. So this is what the due diligence directive is going to focus on. This is what is picked up consistently across all of the legislation that we have in the EU. And you'll see here that we are also talking a little bit about trade unions, the environment, and the contribution to climate change, as well as good governance. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is the name of this piece of legislation. And here we have Didier Reynders, who is the EU Commissioner for Justice. And in his words, he believes that this proposal is a real game changer in the way that companies operate their business activities throughout the global supply chain. So with the rules, what the European Parliament is trying to do is stand up for human rights and lead the way for the green transition. So he was saying we can no longer turn a blind eye on what happens down our value chains just because we, say that we have no control over it. So it is going to be quite tying for a lot of companies. The key provisions of the CSRD, as we'll call it in short, are the following. Firstly, it will come into force in 2024. And it really sets out detailed reporting requirements on the company's impacts on the environment, human rights, and social and sustainability related risks. From 2024, it will apply to large public interest companies who have over 500 employees. And then this will be followed by companies with more than 250 employees or a 40 million revenue in 2025. And finally, it will apply to small and medium-sized enterprises in 2026. So you can see there is a provision to allow that directive to come into force. We have seen from our own experiences with the UK Modern Slavery Act that although that piece of legislation captured larger companies initially, the smaller companies that were feeding into the supply chain of those large companies were having to report officiously on what they were doing around labor and human rights risks also. The other provisions around it is that it's a sector agnostic reporting requirement on environmental, social, and governance issues. It means that it doesn't matter what sector you come from, you will be required to report on social, environmental, and human rights risks. And there will be additional provisions and additional requirements for extra reporting requirements for sector specific that are sector specific. So for example, if you work in agriculture, there may be additional requirements around greenhouse gas emissions or deforestation, etc. There is also this double materiality concept around sustainability. So double materiality concept of sustainability means not only the company's impact on the sustainability issues further down the line, but also how the wider sustainability agenda, global sustainability agenda. And we may see that the SDGs are adopted perhaps as goals, sustainable development goals. The reports will probably have to be independently audited. And there will be obligations and sanctions that will be imposed on companies that are operating on the EU market. And this is what I was saying earlier. So even if you are a UK-based company, and we are no longer affected by EU legislation, if you are working in the EU market, you will have to report the same as any other company. Some of the other provisions that this directive includes around due diligence, it really follows the UNGP very closely. It says that the due diligence strategy has to be embedded in the culture and the structure of a company. This really means that there has to be a governance structure in place. Okay, that the board has to have sign off on this, and it has to have visibility on labor, human rights, and sustainability more widely. The aim is to prevent or mitigate adverse impacts on human rights, labor, and more sustainability issues more widely. There has to be the involvement of stakeholders at all stages of the due diligence process. So on the one hand, there is more focus on trade unions, but they also want to see the involvement of stakeholders at community level. So if communities that are affected by the company's activities, they would want to see those communities being consulted. The other provision is that there is a need for a grievance mechanism. So the due diligence directive says that there has to be early warning mechanisms when there are adverse human rights impacts, and they want this grievance mechanism to also be a mediation system. You will have seen a lot of UK companies recently talking about worker voice mechanisms and whistleblowing mechanisms. This is coming from the UNGP guidance. Again, there would be a need to publish the due diligence strategy, so that public reporting on human rights impacts in supply chains and what the company is doing about those. And then these would need to be audited. So for companies, for example, that are working with third-party certification schemes, so if I'm thinking of agriculture again, or food, the food sector, you know, there are many companies that adopt fair trade or Rainforest Alliance or apply a voluntary standard to their supply chain. So third-party certification can complement the due diligence approach, but it can't replace it. Okay, there still needs to be a global strategy within the business. In terms of how this now then interacts with the pieces of legislation that we have already, in the UK, as I said earlier, we have the Modern Slavery Act. It introduced 2 new civil orders. The first of which was to prevent modern slavery, and the second was to make the provision for the protection of modern slavery victims. Section 54 is the transparency in supply chain section, which applies to businesses that have a turnover of over £36 million. And again, if you are already being affected by the Modern Slavery Act, or you have to report on the Modern Slavery Act, you will know that there is a requirement to publish this statement, but it's not prescriptive. We are not told what you should put into that public statement, but you do have to report on the modern slavery issues within your direct operations and your supply chains. You will have also heard a lot of talk around the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. You know, there has been a lot of talk about us coming out of the European Convention. We were signatories to that in 1951. And then we took the European Convention and we made it into the Human Rights Act into 1998. We turned that into legislation. And what it basically means is that the UK courts have to comply with case law and rulings made in other European courts. So when we are making decisions on legislation, so it means that the British laws have to be compatible with the convention, the European Convention. One of the key provisions of the convention is the freedom and the right not to be tortured or to be protected against slavery and forced labor. And this Human Rights Act applies to all individuals under the jurisdiction of the UK government who can claim for breaches of this right. And this includes individuals living outside of the UK. And I think this is why there's been a lot of noise around the European Convention on Human Rights. It also means that if the EU has legislation on the way that companies behave, it will impact on UK companies eventually. In France, we have the duty of vigilance law, or the devoir de vigilance, and this is the entreprise donneuse d'ordre means businesses that are giving the order. So currently, it applies to companies with over 5,000 employees in France or 10,000 employees globally. There are only about 100, just over 135 or around 150 companies that this currently applies to in France. Again, it builds on the standard due diligence requirement that is stated in the UNGP. So it follows very, very closely on what is the EU directive already. The French law already says there has to be, again, alert mechanisms to identify risks, and they have to be developed in consultation with legitimate trade unions operating within the company. So it means that the company has to have a partnership with a trade union. When it comes to developing the due diligence and strategy, that plan has to be developed in consultation with civil society organizations. So they could be sector-specific organizations or multi-stakeholder initiatives. And again, I think this is to allow companies to build on economies of scale. So you have a lot more clout if you belong to a group and there is a sectoral approach to dealing with a specific issue. For companies that don't meet the French legislation, there is a penalty of up to 10 million euros. So it's quite hefty. It has a lot more teeth than the Modern Slavery Act in the UK in that respect. Then we have the German Supply Chain Act. Again, this came into force this year, right at the beginning of this year. It applies to companies this year with over 3,000 employees. And in 2024, it will apply to companies with over 1,000 employees. It covers all of the labor provisions under the Ethical Trading Initiative Base Code, and also covers the human rights impacts arising from environmental damage. So again, if we're coming back to food, or if you are a company and they're sourcing in country, in Africa, for example, and you have polluted whole tracts of land, that would have an adverse human right impact, and there is a provision in there that you would have to remedy that as a company. So there would be penalties for that in a way. The other provisions that the German law asks for is that companies establish a risk management system. They have an in-house representative for human rights, so they want somebody employed that is actively managing this. That they perform regular risks analysis. So, a lot of you will have heard, well, we've talked about social audits, but there's also risk assessments. This is a way to analyze risks in supply chain. There have to be human rights policies. There also have to be preventative measures in direct operations and supply chains. They would also like to see a complaint procedure, again, whistleblowing procedure. And this again ties in very, very closely with the UNGP and the due diligence law around mediation and the way that we resolve problems with the stakeholders. They want due diligence measures with indirect suppliers, so outside of direct control of the company. And there is also the requirement to report the performance on the due diligence obligations. So again, it mirrors the EU directive very closely. Moving on to the Netherlands, we have the Netherlands Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence Law. This is still a draft at present, but at the moment, the way that it looks is that it's going to be applying to companies with over 250 employees. It's going to be based on the UNGP again, and it will look at 4 main areas. Again, it tracks the same things. It says the same things as the other EU directive, but in a simpler way. It says that you have to assess the actual and potential human rights impact. A company has to integrate and act on the findings. It has to tackle the responses from stakeholders. So if it has issues, it has to tackle those. And finally, it has to communicate about how the impacts are addressed. It's beautifully simple, but it captures the same EU directive in the same way. It is thought that the Dutch law is going to be broader and more stringent than the legislation in Germany, France, and the UK. The Parliament has called for an expansion of child labour law to also cover human rights impacts such as discrimination, environmental damage, and climate change. Although it's not clear how it will do this yet, there is potentially the EU directive as a framework and a model that it's going to be basing itself on. Again, small and medium-sized enterprises with less than 250 employees have a transparency obligation. It means they have to have transparency in their direct operations and their supply chains. It's very similar to the UK Modern Slavery Act in that way. But in order to alleviate some of the heavy duty work that goes around this, it will allow for a sectoral approach, for example, when it comes to creating collective grievance mechanisms or whistleblowing mechanisms. So the food sector or the electronic sector or the construction sector could set up those facilities independently for other companies to use. And it will also ease the transparency requirements if medium-sized companies, if they're working with civil society organizations, trade unions, or multi-stakeholder initiatives. So if you've got a partnership already with a trade union, this will act in your favor. Okay. So globally, what does this mean? Essentially, when it comes to companies working in the EU and developing due diligence around labor and human rights, the key provisions that we would suggest that companies meet are, first of all, that you establish a risk management system on labor and human rights. This firstly requires you to understand what the risks are in your own direct operations in your supply chains. At the Wilberforce Institute, we do a lot of desk reviews for companies looking at their entire supply chains to see whether there are any risks associated with suppliers' names, or the product, or the service, or the area where they operate. We would say hire an in-house representative to start working on human rights, somebody that's responsible for running that strategy and that due diligence strategy internally. Perform regular risks analysis. Again, desk reviews of suppliers is good, but also your direct operations, do risk assessments, do social audits of your own operations to understand how workers are managed. Adopt human rights policies, so labor and human rights policies. Personally, I think the ETI base code is a really good one to start on off with, because it has 10 key provisions that can be monitored and tracked, and there is already a whole world of social auditors out there that are checking these. Establish a preventative measure, so a complaint procedure. A complaint procedure can be internal, and that is great. So that's a grievance measure. But ideally speaking, what we would suggest that companies do is develop whistleblowing hotlines, or have some sort of confidential complaint procedure where people can raise issues confidentially. And that's not only about your own direct staff, but also your suppliers and workers in those supply chains. And then finally, document and report your performance under the due diligence obligations. So a very useful report out there is the Oxfam behind the barcode framework. So that's being used to look at how UK retailers are reporting around the UNGP, but it could be used by anybody. So I would suggest that you have a quick look at that online and see whether you could embed any of those reporting frameworks within your own companies.